Memories of an Exorcist by Júlia Rosell Saldaña. Introduction. We live in a world that we have adapted to our innate abilities. We have become accustomed to trusting our senses without leaving room for what we cannot perceive normally. We do not have the capacity to understand the infinity and complexity of the universe in which we live, much less to pay attention to what we have not been taught to know. What do cats and dogs see that makes us think they are crazy? What is a cat doing following invisible things with its eyes, especially at night? The Homo sapiens, the man, the human, has in some way the senses to a degree that makes us clumsy. We do not have the ability to hear frequencies that other animals hear easily. We cannot see the ultraviolet like most birds or the infrared. The reality that surrounds us is much more complex and extensive than what our senses are capable of experiencing, and we have to rely on technological gadgets to appreciate nuances of existence that surround us and make up part of the universe, but that we are unable to enjoy. Despite this, we do have a capacity for refinement that I doubt many species are capable of perceiving or appreciating. And this is exemplified by the many artistic capacities and both visual and auditory works that we have created since the dawn of time. I am sure that on a universal scale, we must be one of the most creative and curious species in our differences and creative refinement. In any case, in what concerns us, I will focus on talking about those things that can be considered dark or evil, not on a moral scale, but due to a subjective perspective of the human species. After all, our morality is a compass built on the basis of a society similar to that of ants, in which each one occupies a space and function in which social functioning itself must prevail. When I stop to think about it, I get the feeling that we are nothing more than a species that mimics ants in their social work, while our individuality leads us to be like cats. An antithesis of contradictory behaviors that, despite this, lead us to an evident progressivism through the ages and generations that makes us advance as a civilization. Divided into nations, ideologies, countries, religions, and yet from a temporal perspective, we are nothing more than the last second on a 24-hour clock in the history of this planet, of which we have been trying to explain everything for centuries, and the questions from their past continue to haunt us. We are a breath in the existence of the universe, and despite this, we leave a mark that will be erased by the passage of time. We are a young species on an evolutionary scale, with just over 2 million existences. We are a species that has become aware a little less than hundreds of thousands of years ago, and our civilization is little more than 10,000 years old. Even so, we still don't know what makes us conscious, if indeed it does. We do not know in turn if the rest of our existential travel companions, who are other animals, have this consciousness. At present, we don't even know if the artificial life forms we are beginning to create can themselves have sentience. It is even more difficult to determine what has a soul and what does not. We know today that when a Homo sapiens dies, he loses about 17 grams. Could that be the weight of the soul? We do not have any way of knowing or seeing it, and science does not make any pretense of wanting to verify it reliably. In any case, and in a world, a universe and such a complex reality, there is always something else. Since time immemorial, we have known of things that only some individuals of our species have been able to perceive and face. Human spirituality itself has evolved from shamanism to animalistic and elemental pantheons to sun worship, finally to structured and humanized religion. Throughout the world, we appreciate how humanity has evolved not only mentally and socially, but also spiritually. We can see faiths and religions as small pieces of a larger puzzle that allow us to understand and comprehend a more complex existential reality. In what concerns us, I would like to focus on those things that are invisible but still exist. I want to share with those who read this work things that I have seen, heard, and felt that challenge what is established even by science itself, although science is still in its infancy as far as its own development is concerned. Since the scientific method that we know today, he is not yet 300 years old. The beginning. From my earliest childhood, I had always had contact with the unknown. Strange visitors came to me, especially at night, although the older ones always attributed it to the overflowing imagination of a child. I still remember, in that bed that was a car covered by fabrics, as silhouettes darker than the night itself passed by, and even some of those things touched me in the middle of the night. When I got older and had a bunk bed in my room, since that car bed became too small for me, the visits continued, and I used to fall asleep covered by the sheet, imagining that it was a sort of protective force field. Even so, many times those things kept touching me in the middle of the night, waking me up and even speaking to me with words that I was unable to understand due to my young age. I was lucky, however, that most of these visitors exuded benevolence. Perhaps it was my imagination, or perhaps the pure perception of a child transcends the indoctrination of an educational system focused on the artificial productivity of a society that really dehumanizes us. In any case, those visitors began to space their visits until I forgot about them. As I grew older, they visited me at times when the barrier between waking and sleeping came together, when I was in an altered state of consciousness, where I was neither fully awake nor fully asleep. Perhaps because of this, I became interested in occult and bizarre subjects from a very young age. When I had a small television in my room, the series The X-Files and Beyond the Limit became my favourites, although they were shown very late at night, and more than once I earned a reprimand from my parents for staying up late. An addition that always called me was religion. From my early childhood, I was attracted to the idea of religion, and in the school where I studied with nuns, I stood out above the others in said study. I even remember that my friends and colleagues made fun of me because when I grew up, I wanted to be a priest. My religious fervour inspired me, and, at the same time, it revealed to me a world of divine protection that made those darker visitors, who gave off evil in some way, not appear as often. For me, it was an unequivocal proof of the existence of God. The eruption of the internet in my life marked a before and after. That 56-kilobyte modem that my father installed opened up a new world for me where I could get information on practically everything. Despite my young age, my innate curiosity about the occult made me discover things that were not typical of mine, and little by little I grew not only my imagination with fantasy, but also my knowledge of what was called magic and occultism. Language was an impediment, because I was never very capable with English, less so at that age. But I had an idea and used primitive online translators to find out, at least in an incipient way, about those things that were surely written far and wide of the world. For me, the internet was like the Library of Alexandria, and that 1996 Encarta Encyclopedia was my favourite software because it had all possible knowledge at my fingertips without the need for large encyclopedias. At that time, I started to excel in history, which fascinated me, and the Age of Empires game became my favourite, not only for the real-time strategy, but for its historical campaigns that revealed history in its splendour. Over the years, and thanks to the internet, I acquired a very incipient base of English that allowed me to communicate with people all over the world. It was also at this time that I decided to keep a diary of my nightly misadventures of these strange visitors, cataloguing and describing them. I shared my incipient knowledge with strangers in internet forums and chats, where other people in turn expanded my knowledge and made recommendations for works that until then had been unknown to me. I received more than one reprimand from my parents for the high costs of the internet at the time, until, in the year 2000, my parents contracted an ADSL from Telefonica with a flat rate that was much faster than the modem, and that allowed me spend long hours in that virtual world. I discovered Amazon and another passion opened up before me, strange and occult books. Some of the books I bought at that time are still with me. As I got older, so did my knowledge. Even as a teenager, he knew the ins and outs of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and other religions. He also already mastered, albeit in a more basic way, topics such as Santeria, voodoo, black magic, high magic, Kabbalah, among many others. It didn't take me long to acquire knowledge of ancient Mesopotamian and Babylonian rituals, as well as knowledge of religions and cultures already extinct, such as those of ancient Egypt. I was not well versed in school studies, although it was not surprising given my interest in history and religion, as well as the occult. Surely, if I had been evaluated on that knowledge, I would have been considered a genius or a madman. Thanks to that knowledge, I devised methods to stop or expel those evil visitors or even eliminate any trace of strange things that sometimes happened at home. Books that fell by themselves, things that moved from one place or appeared in another, shadows out of place and that did not correspond to the projection of light. Inexplicable cases, but that for me were normal since my early childhood. Somehow I felt powerful for being able to put an end to that sick condition of reality that had no scientific explanation. I carefully noted down my findings and even made step-by-step handwritten manuals for proceeding with such rituals. It was when I came of age that I decided to put my knowledge into practice. Despite being young, very young, it occurred to me to put ads on the internet where I offered to treat those strange cases in which doctors and scientists attributed these events to mental problems of the victims. The first cases. The response, despite some jokes, was overwhelming. It was easy to tell who had a real problem and who was making it up. Most of those cases were suffered by fearful families to whom strange things happened in their home. I remember as if it were yesterday the specific case of a country house in which the lights did not fully illuminate the house, and darkness seemed to reign in an unnatural way. Strange sounds were heard, especially at night, and things moved from place to place as if something were moving them. All this was happening before my eyes, and I understood that it was a case of poltergeist. I had to lie to my parents saying that I was going to a friend's house for the weekend, although obviously it wasn't, and I spent that weekend in that house that could be considered haunted. Despite the fact that the instruments he was carrying were rudimentary, due to my low budget, I was able to verify that the house suffered abrupt changes in temperature, and the cameras captured strange things that today are known as orbs. I was not afraid, unlike that family, because I considered myself a protégé of God, and I was sure that my methods would work. I stayed up all night monitoring, trying to understand if there was any cause, and any routine that followed that entity that seemed to want to stay in the house. I wrote down everything that was happening and tried to somehow establish the degree of evil of that annoying entity. Actually, she didn't seem very evil, since she was only dedicated, if I may say so, to pick on the noses of the residents of the house. At that time, my knowledge and methods were of my own cultivation, and they mixed some expulsion methods that were a mixture of the Christian faith with the Hindu faith. It is amazing how similar there are in the different methods of expulsion in the different cultures of our world. In any case, and after a huge mental and physical effort, on Sunday night, and after doing what my methods allowed, that thing disappeared. The grateful family gave me a good tip even though I told them I didn't want to charge them anything. Over time, they became friends. Another case that caught my attention and is worth mentioning is that of a family that was tormented, night after night, by something that caused them nightmares, and woke up with marks all over their bodies, like if an invisible entity wanted to harm him. They told me that it all started in their old house, and they had already moved twice in a few months trying to get away from it, thinking it was something that was in their home. When they came for me by car at my house, they were explaining in detail that the first victim was her teenage daughter, who had met friends for a typical pajama party, and since then they were harassed by the entity. They explained to me that they went to the doctor several times, although he always argued that it was self-inflicted damage and did not give it more importance beyond notifying the authorities, causing the parents a legal problem because they were at risk of losing custody of their daughter by the of social services. Obviously, that was a red line that made them look for help until they found my ads on the internet. When I met with her daughter, I was aware from the first moment that she was hiding something from me. Lying was not something she was very good at, and I ended up acknowledging that she used the Ouija board that night with her friends. The Ouija is a board game that has the alphabet engraved, the numbers from 0 to new, the words yes, no, goodbye, and some extras depending on the design. It contains a pointer, planchette, used for pointing. The purpose of playing the Ouija board is to be able to communicate with the deceased, although serious practitioners of the occult use the board to contact more sinister entities. In my opinion, a game like Ouija is like using a telephone where you never know who is going to answer it. Unfortunately for us, most of the time it is answered not precisely by benevolent entities, perhaps because those who is more aware of the calls made through said board have interests or objectives that are unknown and incomprehensible to us. I kindly asked him to give me that board and proceeded to destroy it. As in the other case, I spent the weekend with that family trying to find out more about that entity. In any case, and knowing that the main victim had been the daughter of that couple, I proceeded to practice a hypnosis session on her in order to try to contact the entity. Since she was the one who had had the first link, it must be the easiest way to understand what was happening. As a result of that session, I was able to contact the entity. I remember that the girl's voice changed and the language used was educated, much more than it could be for a person of such a young age and with such little literary and linguistic training. The parents were scared, and I had to ask them to please leave the room as their condition was distracting me. I recorded the entire conversation and took notes while questioning said entity. I asked trick questions to make sure it wasn't all fabrication or lies by the teen, and as time went on, it became clear that it wasn't a gimmicky attempt at attention. The conversation was long and tedious, but at the end, I managed to kick that entity out. I stayed in the house one more night awake to make sure that nothing else happened. Again, I collected a generous tip at the will of the family and they were very appreciative. With the church we have run into, I was already 22 years old and the cases followed one after another. I had accumulated a lot of experience and had been able to modernize my equipment and improve my methods. I had a self-confidence that made me believe I was invincible. Everything changed the day I faced something I wasn't prepared for. A possession. Never in my life have I came across such a case. The victim, an 8-year-old girl. The parents had resorted to doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, and even healers, without success, and just as in the previous cases, they found my ads. I thought I was prepared for that case, but what happened showed that I was not. The girl in question seemed, at first glance, to suffer from multiple personality disorder, although today it is known as dissociative identity disorder. In reality, what was happening was that the girl's personality was resisting being absorbed or manipulated by another much more developed and powerful personality that seemed to share that mind. In the room where said girl was locked up, it was unnaturally cold, and that did not correspond to the temperature of August in those parts. An aura of evil and anger filled the room and caused in anyone who stayed too long a discomfort until that made necessary to leave of that room in order to recover emotional and mental normality. I spent days with that girl, locked up with her trying by all means to expel from her that evil entity that only uttered blasphemies and mockery. Despite all my efforts, sleepless nights and trying all the rituals I knew, I failed. It was impossible for me to expel that entity. It was on the third day that a priest showed up at the family's house, introduced himself as Father Asturiano was his surname, and asked me to explain everything I knew about the matter. Apparently, one of the healers the family went to decide to contact the archbishopric, and the priest was sent to make further inquiries. I brought him up to date on the situation, gave him the psychological and psychiatric reports, explained the rituals I had performed, for which he was intrigued and surprised, and showed him my disappointment when I realized my failure. The Father Asturiano put his hand on my shoulder and smilingly told me that I had done what I could, but it was time to give way to the elders. He asked me to come into the room with him and to be quietly watching. He strongly recommended that I do nothing and try to keep my mind blank. The next few hours were filled with the sound of the priest praying in Latin. That day, I was surprised to learn that my knowledge, at least in Christian matters, was nothing compared to that of that older priest. The reaction of that girl was frightening. She screamed. She suffered convulsions while the priest recited those eternal phrases in Latin that were difficult for me to understand, since my knowledge of Latin was based entirely on what I had learned in humanistic high school. There was a time when the priest approached me and ordered me to grab that girl so she wouldn't hurt herself, and to repeat what he said. We spent hours with that complex ritual in which he showed the cross and poured holy water on the girl while we repeated the same phrases over and over again. There came a time when my head couldn't take it anymore. I just wished it would be over and I could take an aspirin. Fatigue took its toll on my ability to concentrate, but by faith I held on. Finally, and after a last batch of sentences, that entity gave up. The girl was unconscious, and the priest congratulated me for my help and efforts. We went to talk to the girl's parents, who immediately noticed how that room had simply become what it was, without strange auras or abyssal temperatures typical of the depths of hell described by Dante in his Divine Comedy. They hugged the unconscious creature between tears while they thanked us for what they had done for long hours. After a snack that I greatly appreciated, the priest and I left that house, and he offered to take me home, to which I responded in the affirmative. During the drive, he made me an incredible proposal. He asked me if I wanted to be his apprentice, to which I said yes, but he made me promise that I would not perform any more rituals, and that I would only focus on what I were learning from him. I promised him that I would accomplish his conditions. We exchanged phone numbers and emails, and he dropped me off at home. We said goodbye, and I went back to my college student routine, my second father. One day, when I was in college, I received a call from a hidden number. I left class and answered that call. At first, I thought it was a joke because they were giving me an appointment to go to the cathedral the next day. The call was from the secretary of Father Asturiano, who told me, above all, to be prepared to dedicate the day to some religious chores. I gladly replied that I would attend, and made a note of the appointment. The next day, I presented myself at the cathedral and entered until I reached the restricted area indicated to me, where the guard at the entrance escorted me to a room that turned out to be a dining room, where he made me take a seat and then left. After a moment, a nun came in and offered me a coffee and some pastries from a convent. I thanked her for the treatment, and she informed me that the Father Asturiano would arrive shortly. I took my coffee calmly while I devoured those delicious pastries. It wasn't long until the priest I met months ago came in. He hugged me, kissed me on each cheek, and proceeded to sit at the table. The nun who had attended me served her the same as me, and the priest was asking me about my studies, my family, and my life in general. We had maintained some contact through email, where he had sent me some documents to study and insisted that I improve my knowledge of Latin, which I did during those months. When we finished, he ushered me into his office. A scrupulous order defined that room full of books, folders, religious paintings, a table and several chairs. The priest sat me down while he opened a large Latin tome. He spent the next few hours explaining to me the parts of a Vatican-recognized exorcism, and he asked me hundreds of questions to make sure that he understood both what he had explained to me and the contents of the tome. He then gave me a copy of the Malleus Daemonum and gave me homework to learn it. That was the first day I spent with the one who would be my teacher in the world of exorcisms. The following months, I went once every week or two to see the Father Asturiano, who gave me private theoretical classes, not only on exorcisms, but also on the types of entities he had faced, the dark arts that some humans practiced since black magic to voodoo and curses, voluntary or not, which have been practiced since time immemorial to cause harm to others. The religious aspect with which he bathed his knowledge made my faith increase, because I understood that in this case, the Vatican had developed an incredible methodology to face all those evils that humanity complained of from other planes or realities. I must say that at that time, I began to distance myself from Catholicism because some parts of its dogma were not convincing to me, as well as the inequality and hypocrisy that the Catholic faith advocated were somehow repugnant and far from the word of Jesus Christ. It was at that time that I began to approach evangelism, specifically Lutheranism. to the point of becoming fully involved in the activities in various churches of that faith. I decided to tell my teacher, who, far from reprimanding me, encouraged me to exercise my faith in pursuit of others and to continue helping, as I had always done. My teacher's approval made me stronger in the faith that I treasured in my heart. I ended up combining studies with small-time jobs, being an exorcist's apprentice, with learning about grimoires and magic books, parties and sprees with love affairs that came and went. Those were years of growth on many levels, since I had the freedom to progress and learn while enjoying the pleasures that life offered me. I still don't know how I had time for everything. The years passed, and it was then that the Father Asturiano deepened my studies, and having spent so much time with the theory and knowledge of what there was, he began to teach me, also at a theoretical level, the ins and outs of the rituals that Catholicism taught its exorcists. I was much more fluent in Latin, and that made learning easier, because for me the texts were already normal readings and even easy to memorize, although sometimes out of simple habit, I translated these texts in my mind, which was a mistake. I must say that in the end, and from what I learned, what made a ritual of this nature more effective was not the content, but the faith of the person who performed it. It was important to have discipline, a strong heart and mind, and, above all, a lot of faith. Seeing my activities in the Lutheran Church, it was the Father Asturiano who decided to further educate me in theology. Thanks to him, I learned the doctrine of the Scriptures, the doctrines of God the Father and God the Son, the backgrounds and panoramas of the Old and New Testaments, apologetics, the history of Christianity and its relations with other religions, Christian ethics and education. In a few years, he gave me an education, something different, from the one given in the seminaries. I had already been studying for 4 years when my teacher told me that I was already prepared to learn through fieldwork. The fieldwork. I was 26 years old when he could finally put into practice what he had learned in the last 4 years, more before, and by protocol, he had to have the authorization of the Vatican. Apparently, not being a Catholic or a priest, special permission was required to proceed with my teachings. It was then that my second father took me before the Archbishop stating my case. He vouched for me. The Archbishop was an older, cordial and affable man who did not doubt the intentions of the Father Asturiano. He asked to leave us alone, and then he questioned me. I answered truthfully, and when he was satisfied, he ushered my second father back in. He told her that he would take care of requesting the authorization for me. We had to wait a few months to receive said authorization, but when it arrived, we celebrated it. It didn't take us many days to have our first case, and we moved to the other end of the province to be able to help a family with a possession case. As required by protocol, the exorcism was only carried out if the rest of the probable causes, medical, physical, environmental, had been previously ruled out through studies certified by specialists in the necessary field. My instructions were clear: see, hear, and shut up, and a little added help, since I was the priest's assistant in these cases. We practiced that exorcism, and I was able to go, little by little, seeing how I should apply the knowledge acquired in previous years. That case was followed by many others, and not only from possessions to people. There were houses that could be considered haunted, cursed objects, possessed objects. The list was long, and I kept a careful record of cases to facilitate my teacher's tasks. Then I digitized them and, obviously, made a copy for myself. Over time, I began to understand why my second father was the official exorcist of his diocese, since he had fully dedicated his life to it and always took time to help colleagues from other dioceses with difficult problems. The following years were marked by entire sleepless nights, rituals that lasted days, weeks, and months. The dedication, despite my many occupations, was full. As I was learning, my teacher made me participate in the rituals by giving me more and more tasks. The see, hear, shut up phase was over. He taught me to bless the water and the hosts. He taught me how to consecrate objects and bless almost anything. When I realized it, The cases that he had done together with my teacher already occupied more than 200 digitized pages. If it had been authorized to publish such cases, it would have been a magnificent book. Below I will detail some of the cases that occurred during this stage. The case of the chickens and the lamb. One day my teacher told me that we should go to a nearby city for an unusual case. A closed apartment was causing strange inconvenience to the residents of the building. As is to be understood, the annoyances went beyond the mundane. When we arrived, we met with the neighbors, most of them South Americans, who had suffered from discomfort for months. According to what they told us, they heard strange voices late at night and even suffered visits from things they could not see, but they caused bruises, physical marks, and the children were the most affected. They told us that in the closed apartment, they had been carrying out Santeria rituals that included the sacrifice of live animals. For those who do not know, Santeria is a religion that mixes the foundations of the African Yoruba religion with Catholicism. It is a polytheistic religion in which there are various divinities or spirits from whom favors are requested, most of them through animal sacrifices. For the believers of this faith, which mixes both religions, there is a supreme God, whom they call Olodumare, who in some way has various extensions of himself that are identified with various things, including objects. These extensions are called orishas, which in Santeria correspond to a certain extent with Catholic saints. Parishioners dedicate their lives and thoughts to an orisha and are supposedly blessed by the orisha in question. In the case that concerns us, and doing a completely illegal activity, we got into the closed apartment. The smell was nauseating and I had to cover my mouth and nose with a cloth. There were marks of dried blood all over the floor, and in the central room there was an improvised altar with bowls full of dried blood next to candles of holy Santeros. We noticed how that floor gave off a dirty aura, since we could not define it in any other way. As was customary, we spent that night in one of the floors of the building with the approval of the owners of that home. We spent that night awake while we studied the lives of the members of the family and tried, using quite complex tools typical of parapsychology, to measure any irregularity that could give us clues about what was happening. My teacher didn't like those devices at all, but over time I made him see that they were useful and showed, albeit precariously, that there were physical manifestations of those things we faced. While my second father slept on the sofa, I was looking at the screens of the thermal cameras in the rooms. It was at 3 a.m. when, while I was drinking a fairly strong coffee, I was forced to spit it out. In the room of the firstborn of the house, a kind of very cold shadow was approaching the child, while the temperature measurements of said room showed how he was getting colder and colder. I woke up my teacher, and we went straight to that room where the cold made our breaths clearly visible. We couldn't see what was in front of us, but we could feel that somehow I yearned for that child, and it didn't give us any good vibes. We proceeded to carry out one of the rituals of the situation, which took us more than 2 hours until the temperature in the room normalized. Interestingly, that child did not wake up until we finished the ritual. The night passed and gave way to a new and sunny day, in which the child's parents were grateful and served us an Ecuadorian breakfast that made me not want food for several days. It was delicious, but the industrial quantities saturated me. We spent that day talking to the babalaos who lived near the building, hoping to find the person responsible for the rituals on that floor so that he could clarify what we were dealing with. The conversations in question did not yield too many answers. The babalawos were reluctant to give details of the rituals, although we already knew them, and they dedicated themselves to rambling about the harassment that meant not being allowed to perform their rituals. Finally, we found one who did speak. He was a relative of the person in charge of the rituals in that building, and he explained to us that his relative was not a babalawo. He had been expelled from the community for having carried out incorrect rituals and for having put more than one person in trouble. According to him, not performing the rituals correctly could make the orishas angry. It could even make them not return the way they had come when they finished. so they looked for a source of power to cling to, causing harm to those who lived nearby. That man was very kind, and even invited us to witness the baptism of a new member of the community. Out of respect and politeness, we agreed, so he asked us to accompany him to his 4x4, and he took us to a vacant lot on the outskirts of the city, where there were about 20 people, about 4 roosters and 2 lambs. Despite the cordiality of our host, who invited us to join the ritual, we indicated that we preferred to see him from afar. What we saw next seemed to us certainly barbaric. They had lit bowls with some kind of incense, they gave each other coloured necklaces, and they took one of the hens, which they bathed in rum. When they had left her with a noteworthy degree of alcoholization, they cut her throat. The trail of blood that was left was collected in bowls that were left on the altar, while on a plate with necklaces of eggs, they watered these in the blood of the animal. We didn't quite understand the chants they uttered, which were largely reminiscent of typical African chants due to their tone, but everyone there seemed to be in a trance. Our host, the Babalawo, brought a young man to the altar who was apparently going to be reborn in the Santera religion. He put coloured necklaces on it and struck it gently with a bunch of herbs, then passed one of the bowls of incense in front of it. Then he signalled for a lamb to be brought to him, which he dipped in rum, as he did the hen. He then slit his throat and filled a bowl, which he poured blood over the young initiate while he uttered prayers. The ritual lasted almost 2 hours. When they finished, the Babalawo came up to us and thanked us for coming, to which we responded by thanking him for the invitation. He told one of the assistants to take us by car to the city, where he left us in the building where the problem was happening. Having not slept all night, we were exhausted. Our hosts offered us a good coffee, and again, we got into that closed apartment. Having seen what one of those rituals was like, we understood that in some way, that floor had become the entrance portal of some profane entity that, for whatever reason, could not or did not want to return, waiting for more offerings to bite into. We spent the whole night cleaning the flat, disinfecting it, removing bloodstains from the floor and walls. In the end, I asked my teacher to go to sleep and I finished the job. He took me all night, but I managed to leave the apartment spotless. The next thing I did was get rid of the altar and the bowls, as well as everything else that could be considered part of the Santera religion. I put it all in huge black garbage bags and called the archdiocese to have it all taken away for destruction, probably in some kind of incinerator. My teacher came to see me with a more than welcome cup of coffee. I drank it while it tasted like heaven. I was downright exhausted. Seeing that the floor was clean, the Father Asturiano went to get his portable altar, and we spent the day performing the necessary rituals to eliminate any influence of the Orisha in that building. When night came, it was clear that we had succeeded. That night, we were able to sleep peacefully. The next day, the residents of the building, who apparently were finally able to rest, invited us to eat at a nearby restaurant, and when we finished, we said goodbye to all of them with a smile. The case of the 5-pointed star. A locked room, a murder, and a 5-year-old boy who allegedly did it. Thus begins a horror story in which, due to the minor's young age, he could not be judged as responsible. When I was informed of the case and that the mother had suspected something strange in her son for a few weeks, I first thought that it was the poor woman's depression or even a joke. In cases like this, as strange as it sounds, we are used to being in close contact, albeit informally, with the police. In this particular case, a police officer brought us up to date on the case, in which the father had died from lacerations to the neck, his 5-year-old son being the only one in that room. Neither the mother, nor the grandmother, nor the babysitter were at home that day. The voice of alarm was given by her mother when she arrived home and found the body of her husband. She went to the scientific police, and at first, the grandmother took care of the child while she arrested her mother as her main suspect. After a few days of analysis, interrogations, and other tasks of the police and prosecutor's office, it was left as something strange with a 5-year-old boy as the murderer, something that according to the legislation could not be judged. After the explanation and reports provided by the police, we focused on studying the room, which had been thoroughly cleaned and left spotless. The room was decorated for the child's entertainment, as it was his room. A bed and toys everywhere left no room for doubt. A hanging painting caught my attention, which I touched out of simple curiosity. Since it was hanging badly, it gave way and fell to the ground. Behind it was painted an inverted 5-pointed star. For those who do not know symbols like this, I must explain that the normal 5-pointed star, also called a pentagram or tetragrammaton, is one of the oldest protection symbols that exist. This simple 5-pointed star can mean in turn many things: the power of Mother Earth, the 5 elements. Traces of its use have been found since 3500 BC. The symbology is powerful, but it is neutral. It is neither good nor bad, but it acquires the aspect that is given to it in its use. For example, the Christian Holy Cross is upside down to represent Christianity and Jesus Christ, while upside down it means the Antichrist and evil. The same thing happens with the 5-pointed star. When it is on the right, it is a symbol of protection. When it is upside down, it is a symbol of curse. This symbol is used, above all, by groups that practice black magic, Satanists and along, etc. I showed the symbol to the mother and grandmother, asking them if they knew anything about the symbol or who could have made it. The surprise on their faces was not unexpected, and they feared the worst. We took pictures, and it occurred to me to see if that was red paint or not. Despite being dirty, I scratched some of that dye and tried it. It wasn't paint. The metal taste made it clear it was blood of some sort. It was difficult to smell her due to the mixture of odours in the room and the air freshener they used to keep the child calm. We had a hard time removing it, but the worst was the child's reaction, who told us that he liked that drawing and that he was getting very angry that we removed it. As usual, we did not give it importance. While I was removing that symbol, I felt a puncture in my right calf and screamed. When I turned around, I saw that the boy had stabbed me with a box cutter. I don't know where he got it from, but blood was gushing out while a stabbing pain made me bend over. Hearing my cry, the mother came running and scolded her son. I took out the cutter and asked them to give me something to clean and heal the wound. The grandmother performed the first aid, and both my teacher and I began to suspect that something was wrong with that child. We stayed for dinner with the family, who obviously did so at a time when they could have dinner with the child. My teacher, who was much cleverer than I in these matters, took a pentagram out of his pocket and played with it during dinner. Both the rest of the diners and I tried to pretend that we didn't see him. Curiously, the boy asked for that pentagram insistently, to the point that when his mother refused to have it, he threw the food on the floor. He earned another scolding from his mother, but all he got was the boy laughing sickly. My teacher gave him the pendant, and the boy began to play with it, always holding it upside down. We continued eating until the infant began to say single words in ancient Hebrew, at which point my teacher and I looked at each other and decided to wait until they put him to bed to talk to the adults in the household. We asked them questions about where the child could have learned these words, to which they replied that they did not know, but he had been saying them for weeks. They thought it was some language invented by the child. When we tried to delve deeper into the matter, a suspect emerged: the kangaroo. We came back the next day, and there was the babysitter, who was taking care of the child while the mother worked. Grandma was doing homework on the sofa, and she got up to make us coffee. We asked the woman to be there for the child while we talked to the babysitter. I showed her the pictures of the inverted pentagram on the wall, which she denied knowing anything about, but it was clear she was lying. The grandmother interrupted us, saying that the child asked for her syrup, and she did not know which one she was referring to. At that moment, the kangaroo became nervous, red, and she began to sweat. We asked her what syrup the boy was talking about, and she pretended that she didn't know what we were talking about. The grandmother, who was not there for nonsense and with the child in her arms, went to the babysitter's bag and rummaged through it until she took out a small bottle with a greenish-brown liquid. She gave it to us and went with the child to her room. When I had it in my hands, and before the kangaroo's look of panic, I opened the bottle and smelled its contents. It smelled of pretty strong herbs, with alcohol, which made me throw my head back in shock. I asked the woman what was in the jar, and she told me that she didn't know, that it had been given to her like that for the child. When I asked her who gave it to her, she replied that she couldn't tell me, to which I replied that if she didn't want to tell me, the police would be happy to know that she had given drugs to a minor. The babysitter began to cry, and she told us that she gave her that drink. She had painted that pentagram and read things to her that she did not understand at night because they had told her. That she just wanted to earn some extra money and she didn't want to hurt anyone. That she didn't expect anything bad to happen. When the grandmother heard that, she came running, she put the child in my arms and got into an argument with the babysitter until she kicked her out of the house. The babysitter, while she was leaving, threw some papers, apologized, and left. We never saw her again. I tried to calm the poor woman who was very upset while my teacher took care of the child. When she calmed down, I picked up the papers from the floor and looked at them carefully. It was a transliteration of the Hebrew that I couldn't understand very well. It was my teacher who realized that it corresponded to some kind of invocation or similar, but the meaning was so distorted that it was difficult to understand what being or entity he was trying to invoke. We understood that something had been done to that child, and luckily, he was still in the early stages. We kept the papers and the little bottle and waited for her mother to come back to tell her everything, hoping that she would give us her approval to exorcise that child. Despite her reluctance at first, mother and grandmother agreed and we performed the proper rituals, which lasted 3 days. When we finished, that restless, impatient, aggressive and nail-cutting child became an innocent and smiling child that his mother recognized again. The case of the bloody nymphomaniac. Drugs, sex and alcohol. The leitmotif of many people. In this case, a young woman my age, 26, had recently been released from a mental institution due to her previous acts. This young woman, she had dropped out of school and spent whole days away from home. Such a case would not raise suspicions. Plus, the wounds she had gave clues to those in the know that something out of the ordinary was happening. As in other cases, the mother of said young woman went to my teacher explaining her situation, to which she first argued that they were youth problems. Everything changed when she showed him the photographs of her wounds, bruises and stigmata that the young woman could not have inflicted on herself or, at least, should not have left her as if she had nothing. She told him that the young woman had been abusing drugs and alcohol for a long time, and she had sex with strangers at a level that was making her suffer a lot. She even told us that once she accompanied her to the doctor, she hooked up and had sex with the driver of the train they were on. She felt tremendously ashamed, and she and her husband had decided to put themselves in the hands of medical specialists. She gave medical and psychiatric reports to my teacher explaining the medical treatment that had been given to her. To no avail, probably because she did not take it, when she was declared incapacitated and admitted to the psychiatric hospital, among many other data that now they are of no interest. After 3 months in the psychiatric hospital and seeing a certain improvement in the young woman's attitude, she was handed over to her parents so that they could take care of her in her home. Coexistence was difficult because it was difficult for them to take the medication, apart from the attitudes, insults, discussions, and even the comments that she just wanted to fuck. These events had caused her parents to call several medical professionals, all of whom commented that her best idea is for her to remain hospitalized, to which the parents refused, seeing that she had not been of any use. It was then that her mother decided to come to ask Father Asturiano for advice. 2 days after that visit, we went to the family home, located in a fairly luxurious development. The parents gave us a warm welcome, despite the exhaustion and resignation on their faces that we felt sorry for. It didn't take long for us to understand that exhaustion when we heard the screams of the young woman who had been locked in her room. From what her parents told us, for days, they had had to put bars on the window of her room so that she would not escape from it, and in her current state they had to take care of her, even to wash her. It was an ordeal that they did not know how to face. They made us go into the dining room and sit down, where they gave free rein to her negativism and discomfort. They both cried and asked us for help. My teacher was comforting them while I didn't know what to say. Then when they stopped crying, he ordered me to go check on the locked-up young woman, which I thought was a joke until he gave me a look that penetrated to the depths of my being. The father gave me the key to the padlock on the door, and I proceeded to enter. The room was a mess and bone-chilling cold. Before me there was this young woman, certainly very good-looking, who immediately tried to seduce me. I resisted as much as I could until I managed to get her away from me. Then I left the room and closed the padlock while a cold sweat slid down my forehead. I stood in front of the door, breathing deeply, trying to calm down, until I felt a dull thud on the back of my neck. It was my teacher who had given me a smack that resonated even in the beams of that house. The Father Asturiano asked me for explanations as to why he had left the room, to which I responded by explaining the young woman's attitudes that had made me nervous. He gave me another smack and told me that my job was not to get upset or manipulated. I don't think I've ever seen him so angry. We went back to the dining room, sat down with the parents, and reviewed one by one all the medical reports, photographs and data that we had before we were certain that the only solution was an exorcism. When night fell, that screaming young woman began to bang. Her parents told us that when the sun disappeared, she became much more nervous, and that once they had to administer painkillers intramuscularly to make her fall asleep. Both my teacher and I tried to give an image of calm and serenity that we hoped would help the poor girl's parents to calm down in turn. We were able to observe that our presence, despite not giving them all the necessary peace, did calm them down to the point that we were able to speak quietly, despite the background noises. We explained our impressions of the case, and that, before proceeding, we should spend time with the young woman. The parents, clearly desperate, accepted. They locked us in that room with the young woman. My teacher showed a serenity that I was unable to achieve. That young woman spent the time insulting us when she saw that she couldn't seduce us, and in the end, we had no choice but to tie her to her bed to heal the wounds from which blood spurted. While I was treating the wounds, the Father Asturiano tried to maintain a long but leisurely conversation in which lucid phrases interspersed with insults and delusions. After about 3 hours, my teacher told me that this was indeed a possession. The father came through the door with food and water for his daughter, which I had to take care of, giving her as best I could due to the girl's inability to keep still. He had nursed and fed her, and the most I took was spit and scratches when I was within reach of her. The following hours, in which we dedicated ourselves to the rituals, were full of screams, tremors in the room, and an icy cold that made our blood run cold. When the young woman lost consciousness, we made sure that her constants were fine. We untied her and left the room. We informed the parents that we would return the next day to continue with the rituals. My teacher left me at home, and the first thing I did was take a shower to remove all that physical and mental dirt that I had accumulated during my visit to that house. When I was sanitized, I went straight to bed. I don't know if it was because of that young woman's influence, because of my hormones and my youth, or because of a mixture of everything. The dreams I had that night were quite wet. The next day they came for me by car to take me back to the house of that possessed young woman. When I arrived, the Father Asturiano was already there having breakfast and ordered me to do the same so as not to offend our hosts. I had breakfast in silence next to him while I thought, nervously, that this situation was beyond me. When we finished breakfast, we prepared all the materials to continue the ritual and went back into that room. The young woman was silent. It was clear that she was waiting for us. The young woman, who the day before had not stopped screaming and insulting, was now calm and defiant. As my teacher silently prepared the materials for the ritual, she started trying to strike up a conversation with him, to which she ignored and continued preparing everything. When she saw that her attempts to talk about her with the priest were unsuccessful, she chose me as her victim. She started praising me, saying sexual profanity to me, and even she came up to gently caress my face. I ignored what she did and she said, and helped my teacher prepare everything. It didn't take long for the young woman to lose her calm, and she returned to hostility, which made us have to stop preparing to tie her up again. I made sure the straps were tight and went back to helping my teacher prepare the ritual. When we had everything ready, we started. The young woman began to get more upset and insult us incessantly while she tried to free herself from the straps. She was hurting herself, and a part of me wanted to help her, but I was stopped by my teacher, who reminded me that the ritual had to be followed at all costs. For 2 hours, we were with the ritual until the young woman let go. She had broken the straps. She must have superhuman strength to be able to break free. Fear invaded me, but thanks to my teacher, who at that moment held me tightly by the hand, I understood that we had to continue. The young woman kept insulting and trying to distract us. She even grabbed me tightly and made a gesture of rubbing her private parts with my left leg. Despite the difficulty in concentrating, I continued with the ritual. I was with my eyes closed to concentrate more until I noticed how that young woman was rubbing her breasts on my face. I ignored it, and we continued for hours with that ritual until the young woman fell unconscious again. I didn't understand how my teacher did it because I was exhausted, and he seemed to be like always. It is early in the morning, and we asked to stay in the house to continue with the ritual the next day. The next day was, at least in the performance of the ritual, a photocopy of the previous day. We spent long hours performing it until finally a cross-shaped stigma on the young woman's forehead marked that the ritual had been successfully completed. When she fell unconscious this time, all that coldness that invaded the room disappeared. And again we spent the day in that house waiting for the young woman to wake up to see what her condition was. The following days we went to see the young woman, who now only had the symptoms of drug and alcohol withdrawal. With time and proper medical treatment, she got her life back on track. The case of the crying extractor. A house near the mountain. A small town without tourist interest. A family that wakes up every morning by someone crying. The case, which would not be more important if the cries and moans did not come out of an extractor hood. The matter reached the press, who gave it few words and took it as a joke, and both police and firefighters gave up trying to find out the origin of those noises that appeared at night and early in the morning. We were given the case and went to the house one afternoon where we talked to the family. The noises always started at night and became unbearable at dawn. Being a humble family, they could not go to a new home, and the situation prevented them from selling the house. I investigated said extractor looking if there was anything, even though it had already been checked by police and firefighters, and I found nothing. A few hours after nightfall, I was startled by the crying that started out of nowhere and came from the extractor fan. As I was farsighted, I brought a frequency jammer that I activated in the hope that it was all a joke made with some wireless system because a person could not fit in said extractor, and, being a single-family house without physical contact with other houses, it was impossible that someone dedicated himself to performing the pranks in question. I went outside and asked for a long ladder, which I climbed to the roof where I went to the exhaust fan. Nothing was heard. Those cries and moans could only be heard inside the house. Confused, I went back downstairs and back into the kitchen, removing the vents from the range hood and shining a flashlight inside. There was nothing at all, but the crying continued. Then I grabbed a broomstick and felt inside the extractor fan. The crying stopped, but then the moans started about something that he said was hurting him. The situation was strange but comical at the same time. My teacher couldn't help but laugh. We decided to start with the rituals, which the entity complained about endlessly, until it disappeared. These rituals occupied us 2 days of our lives. The following days, we were in contact with the family of that house until they confirmed that it had disappeared in the same way that it appeared out of nowhere. Here ends the summary of some of the cases of this stage. The progression of the faith. I was already 30 years old when one of the churches I attended offered to order me a priest. For me, the news was a shock. I did not expect such an honor. At first, I hesitated, not considering myself worthy of such a mission, because the priesthood, despite being different from the Catholic one, maintained many of its customs and manners, and involved a dedication that I doubted would have enough time, as well as having the right level to carry out all the functions that were going to be entrusted to me. Showing doubts, one of the priests I knew invited me to eat. What I did not expect is that that meal was actually a meeting with several Lutheran priests who quoted me all the things he had done in recent years in the churches where he went. They explained to me that with my knowledge I was sufficiently prepared, and they tried to convince me to accept. Finally, I said yes, and all the attendees joyfully celebrated having a new priest of their faith among their ranks. A few days later, my ordination as pastor was celebrated in one of the churches. Dozens of people came, and the nerves invaded me. It was not explained to me how this act would be carried out. I was made to go to the altar. Various passages from the Bible were read, and I was made to speak in public. The event itself was full of good vibes and was, without a doubt, one of the happiest days of my life. When I looked at the audience, I saw that my teacher was there, with tears of emotion running down his cheeks. I could see in his eyes that he was proud of me. When I finished, he ushered me to the back of the altar and gave me the habit I would then wear. I went in the side door and changed. I went out dressed as a priest and was invited to give a sermon. Then I was invited to give my first religious service. The ceremony was solemn, and I felt supported by all those present who joyfully celebrated my ordination. The recognition of the Holy See. A few weeks into my new assignments as pastor, the archbishopric called me to tell me that I needed to meet with the new archbishop. I didn't know what it was about, and I decided to go see my teacher. He happily told me that having finished my apprenticeship, I must add that with note, he had been recognized by the Vatican as a non-Catholic exorcist. It was he who had submitted a report on my progress in order to get such recognition. At that moment, I didn't know how to react, because I didn't know what that meant either. I asked my teacher for details, and he told me that there would be a ceremony at the archbishopric to give me my new title. After a few days, a letter arrived at my house explaining the details. I had to go to the archbishopric on a certain day and time with my robes and go to the archbishop's office. It wasn't very complicated, and so I did. The new archbishop was not like the previous one. He was a tall, bald man with horn-rimmed glasses and quite serious. Before the ceremony, he wanted to meet with me, so I sat across from him in his office and had a long conversation full of questions and even doubts about my abilities. After what I learned with my teacher, I was firm and calm. When we finished, he made me go to a room full of books and told me to wait there, that they would come for me. It wasn't long before a deacon came for me to take me to the archbishop. We walked through unknown corridors until we reached a chapel under the archbishopric, where the archbishop was, some parish priests, nuns, and, standing out among them for his smile, my teacher. They ushered me in while they were praying. The archbishop made me kiss his hand and expounded in Latin my new rank. When he finished, he gave me a parchment on which it was obvious that he had written in fresh ink and placed it in my hands. I thanked him and got up when he told me. He hugged me and congratulated me on my title. Then he turned me around so he could greet everyone in the room, and everyone present made the sign of the cross with their hands. Immediately afterwards, I was asked to say a few words, which I dedicated above all to my teacher, and then I thanked the archbishop and those present for that moment that I treasured in my heart. The freedom of a new beginning. Having been recognized as an exorcist by the Vatican, but not being ascribed to the Catholic faith, I did not have all the benefits of the rest of the priests, but I did recognize some quite interesting ones. I could help other Catholic exorcists, and I could stay in any of the buildings of the Catholic Church. My teacher was explaining to me that now that he had already passed the apprenticeship, he was free to use the methods that he considered. He was well-grounded and had had one of the best exorcism teachers in Europe. I can say that to this day, I have had to use few methods other than those he taught me, since his teachings are still with me today. The following months were full of small trips around the country where I visited other dioceses and where I met many people. I didn't like the everything-free culture that my degree offered me, but I tried to make good use of it and never abuse it. In those months, I made good friends throughout the country, with whom I keep in touch even today. Below I will detail some of the cases that occurred during this stage. The case of the alcoholic priest. The first case I faced alone was, precisely, that of a priest who had lost his way. He had been replaced by another priest, and he hadn't been seen outside the parsonage for weeks. Some witnesses from the town rumoured that he only went out on full moon nights and got lost in the thick of the fields on the outskirts. The case would not be more important if it were not for the fact that the housekeeper of the parish house left her job when she found the priest naked, screaming, and with the walls of said house painted with enormous letters that she could not identify. Being an internal matter and due to the bad news affecting the parish office in recent times, I was sent to investigate, said pastor. When I arrived at the town by bus, a delegation led by the mayor came to receive me. Apparently the excuse was that he had come to fix some things in the church and to try to help the local priest, about whom the neighbours were very concerned. They took me to the parish house and gave me the keys. I said goodbye to that entourage, put the key in the door, turned it and entered. Inside there was a nauseating smell. It had been weeks since that house had been cleaned and, because of the stench, whoever lived in it had taken the same habit. The house was lit by candles. When I tried to turn on the electric light, it didn't work. The movement of the candles made those letters that were on the walls and that the housekeeper had described look gloomy. By intuition, I opened the curtains on all the windows to let in light from outside and called the priest, who did not answer. I was looking all over the house, which was a mess, until I found his strange tenant. The poor man was sitting in a corner with his head in his arms. The stench he gave off was unbearable. He hadn't eaten or drank for days and seemed to be in a trance state. Beside him, several empty bottles of church wine. I approached carefully and speaking softly, almost whispering, although I didn't get a reaction. I decided to grab his arm to try to get him to at least fix his eyes on me. I got it, and he looked at me wide-eyed without saying a word. He did not react normally, given the situation and that it seemed that he had no problem following orders. I picked him up and took him to the entrance room, where I sat him on a sofa. I went into the kitchen and filled a glass with tap water, which I held out for her to drink. The poor man was dying of thirst, and I had to pour him about 8 glasses until he was satisfied. Oh. Then I looked at what was in the fridge and made him a ham omelette, which I fed him little by little. She ate it with relish, but still didn't speak. I then took him to the bathroom, where I cleaned him up and then shaved him. When I was done, I helped him get dressed in clean clothes and sat him back down in the living room. While he was in that state, I cleaned the house as best I could, dusting and scrubbing. Then I opened the windows to at least ventilate the house. The priest's attitude changed when I began to clean the letters painted on the wall. As he stood up, startled, and tried to move me away from the wall. I gave up cleaning and sat him back down. I put one of the armchairs in front of his and sat staring at him, waiting for some kind of reaction. That man was not in his right mind. Half an hour passed when he asked me for a glass of wine. I poured it for him and sat down across from him again, hoping he'd be more cooperative with the alcohol. He finished the glass, and immediately he asked me for another, to which I replied that I would not give him more until he explained to me what was happening to him. His face changed completely. He opened his eyes wide again and raised his arms in the air. Immediately afterwards, he began to tell me that he hoped to see again that beauty that had visited him every full moon and filled him with pleasures. He got up and pointed to the letters on the wall, which he said were a way to call that woman, and that's why he didn't want him to remove them. I poured him another glass of wine and, seeing that he was calm, I went to try to fix the electricity in the house. As I was unable, I went out to buy food and asked for an electrician in the town store. I went to look for him, and he immediately repaired the fuse box. Now that the lights were back on, I blew out the candles and chatted with the priest, who was becoming more talkative. Being clean and shaven, that man of about 50 seemed to be quite normal, although he once again had a bottle of wine by his side that he must have given during my absence. Seeing that he felt comfortable, we talked about what he wanted. I let him talk and talk while he didn't seem to notice his previous state, or that of the house. When I saw that he was beginning to waver, I hinted that the best thing would be for him to go to sleep. I accompanied him to his room and tucked him in to sleep. I headed to the guest room and got ready for bed, leaving the door open in case my alcoholic roommate needed anything. It was hard for me to fall asleep when I heard that priest speak in my sleep, but in the end, I gave in to exhaustion and fell asleep. That night, I dreamed of things from my college years mixed with my work. Everything went on until something woke me up. It was dark and quiet, but I felt that something was not right. Since I was sleeping on my side, I decided to change my position to look up. Then I saw it, a figure in the doorway carrying a knife. It was the priest, who lunged at me. I defended myself with my arm and the sheets as best I could, while that man tried to stab me. I managed to get away from him and he backed away, dropped the knife on the ground and clutched his head with both hands while laughing hysterically. I got up and chased him into the kitchen, where he smashed a bottle and cut his wrists. Seeing that, I decided to knock him unconscious. I stretched him out on the ground and gave him first aid. Then I called the emergency room, which sent an ambulance. And I went with him to the hospital in a nearby town. I had to explain to both the ambulance crew and the emergency room what had happened. It was decided to enter that man in psychiatry and keep him under observation. That night was long, but on the one hand, the matter was in the hands of the health management. A taxi took me back to town. I decided to stay in the parish house for a few days while I dedicated myself to searching, both in the church and in the house, for any vestige of that madness that afflicted the priest. Since I could no longer sleep that night, I began my search in both places until I found a diary and several sketches. The priest had artistic abilities worthy of admiration, and the sketches of that woman who said that she visited him on full moon nights were of unparalleled beauty. In the diary, several dozen pages long, he narrated the first appearance of that woman, how he gave her instructions to call her, and suggested that she go to a hermitage near the outskirts of town to make blood sacrifices for her. The next day, I asked the locals about that hermitage, which they told me was located between brush and trees on the outskirts. I didn't take long to go, and I realized that it had been abandoned for at least 80 years. The door was badly locked, and it didn't take me long to unlock it and go inside. Inside, there were cat corpses on the floor and bloodstains everywhere. On the altar, there was a bowl with the rotten organs of said cats. Given the situation, I decided to call the ecclesiastical authorities to report the situation and what I had found out, to which they told me that they would send a cleaning team to leave that hermitage as good as new and would monitor the priest admitted to the psychiatric ward. I went to the town hall and asked about the hermitage in question, so they took me to the town archives so I could read what was known about it. Apparently, that hermitage stopped being used after the Spanish Civil War, and there were many stories from centuries ago in which that area was used by witches and strange people to carry out pagan rituals. It was decided to build the hermitage at the point where they celebrated rituals to ward off all evil. When I looked at old maps, I saw that the hermitage was erected in the middle of a crossroads that no longer existed, or at least it was not visible due to the amount of weeds there were. Crossroads have always been the object of rituals and magical uses since ancient Rome small temples dedicated to divinities were erected, and it was even customary to perform rituals at night to invoke Hecate or other divinities to ask them for favors. It was a bad omen to find yourself in the middle of a crossroads at night, since strange entities could appear and use said points as passageways. Over the centuries, the Catholic Church transformed those pagan shrines into small shrines dedicated to Catholic saints, and at the points with the most energy, or that had been used for rituals, hermitages were erected, marking the exact site of the most powerful. That is why throughout Europe there are hermitages everywhere, especially in remote or very difficult to access places, and even tiny temples dedicated to the saints, especially at crossroads. When I finished the investigation, I wrote a report and went to sleep, as I was exhausted after that night. I woke up the next day to a knock on the door of the parsonage. When I opened, a team from the diocese had arrived to clean the hermitage in question. I cleaned up, changed, and accompanied them to the hermitage, where we dedicated ourselves to cleaning and tidying it up. When we finished, and due to my rank, I was asked to do a cleansing ritual, which they helped me with chants and prayers. Hours passed, and somehow we had left the hermitage like new. They even fixed the door and cleaned up the altar and statues inside it. We returned to town and went to eat at the town bar, where it was clear that rumours were already spreading about what was happening. Some of the locals, more daring than the rest, asked me questions about what was happening, to which I answered with half-truths, in which I referred to a nervous breakdown of the parish priest, and that it had been decided to tidy up the church's properties in these lands. The day passed quickly, and when I realised night was falling, I went back to the parsonage and prepared to sleep again. That night, which was the night of the full moon, I was woken up by footsteps in the living room. I took a broom and left my room hoping to find a thief, but there was nothing there. I checked the whole house and there was no one, so I decided to go back to bed. As I was falling asleep, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It looked like the silhouette of a woman calling me by name. I jumped up and saw that there was no one there. Perhaps it was a simple hallucination, or my imagination due to fatigue, but I decided not to rule anything out, and went for the equipment that I had brought in the suitcase to make sure that there was nothing strange. The instruments I brought left no room for doubt. Electromagnetic interference and random changes in the temperature of the house showed that something strange was happening. I spent the night doing a spiritual cleaning of the house until those phenomena disappeared. I couldn't help but remember the legends of succubi from the Middle Ages. Finished the matter, I was able to return to my city and my home and forget about that matter. From what I learned, the new priest was able to live in peace in that house, and the events that had driven the previous priest to madness did not happen again. About the alcoholic parish priest, he never recovered and was taken to a church monastery for his care. The case of the medium child, a boy who talks with invisible friends, strange things that happen in a house, and a very scared family. The case at hand was referred to me because other priests versed in the arts of exorcism were unable to solve the problem. As was customary, a car came for me to go to the village, and the parish house in said village was offered to me as accommodation. I interviewed the family, who said they suffered strange phenomena at home, from the classic poltergeist, objects that move from place to place, disappear and reappear, knocks on walls and doors without apparent cause, etc., to changes in temperature and things that moved out of the corner of the eye, causing discomfort to the residents. Apparently, 2 priests had already come who had tried without success to stop those events. After verifying the veracity of that problem and making sure that there was no physical or scientific reason for it after a rigorous study as stated in the protocols, I decided to study the case with a parapsychologist. The following days were marked by the use of recorders, infrared cameras, electromagnetic detectors, among other gadgets that allowed us to demonstrate what was happening in that house. I saw no real reason to perform an exorcism, since the nature of those events did not seem evil, and I wanted to try a new approach, talk to the child supposedly responsible for it. The boy, who was 8 years old, had been through several doctors until it was determined that he did not suffer from any type of mental disorder. I simply saw an infant curious about the world around him and understood that the case should be studied from the perspective of the child, treating the cause, not the consequences. This creature told me that he had many friends who wanted to play, who wanted to feel loved and attract attention. The poor thing must not have been aware of his abilities, and I talked to his parents so that, if they gave permission, A person with more knowledge in the matter could talk to him and teach him to master those abilities. It is not common for humans to have any perception about paranormal things, but some infants are born with this ability, and over the years, due to lack of interest or simple maturation, they lose it. Some have that capacity all their lives, and not being able to control it or having an education related to it, end up medicated for life and treated as schizophrenics, among others. After the affirmative response of the parents, I brought an old friend who was a medium since her early childhood. Due to her abilities and the time that was taken from her, she was fully dedicated to activities related to being a medium since she could not work on anything else. She arrived in a taxi that same afternoon. The woman arrived and introduced herself to the parents. Immediately afterwards, she asked their permission to study the entities that were in the house, to which the parents agreed. As she went back and forth between the rooms, she told us that she perceived those entities and that they did not show any indication of malice. I was calm when I heard those words. When she finished, she asked the parents to speak to the boy, who again agreed. My friend talked at length with the boy and explained things that only she could understand, making him see that this was normal. Apparently, they coincided in her visions, and according to her, they were even able to speak with those entities. After more than an hour and a half talking with the infant, the woman came back to us and explained to the parents that the child was very special and that he had innate abilities that had to be decided if he was educated to control them or they would be inhibited so that he could have a normal life. My friend focused on the pros and cons of the decision parents had to make, and she was clearly in favor of inhibiting those abilities. The parents, listening to the woman's advice, asked us to do what was necessary to put an end to that situation. I spoke with my friend, and we decided to practice a hypnosis session on the child to block these abilities. The session was a success, and when we finished, the phenomenon that afflicted that family also ended, the case of the shadow people. For those who do not know, most human cultures speak of dark beings with a human silhouette that are seen out of the corner of the eye and cause discomfort in those who see them. They are also related to sleep paralysis, something that most humans have suffered in their lives, that consists of being conscious in the middle of the night without being able to move while feeling panic about something. Sometimes, these shadow people try to harm the victim, sitting on top of them, or causing chest tightness. From my experience, the shadow people I've come across display a malicious attitude towards humans, and the one that scares me the most is the one in human form with a hat. In the case at hand, I received a request for help from an exorcist in a distant city. A country house was, according to the words of said priest, infested with dark entities that caused damage to the 4-generation family that lived there. I went to that city with a parapsychologist experienced in shadow people, and we could feel, just by entering, that that country house that seemed quite normal was actually keeping some kind of dark secret, since it gave us a feeling of discomfort that we did not know. It was normal. The parish priest in charge of that area updated us on what had happened, and after speaking with the family and with the church, we managed to get them rehoused in a nearby hotel at paid costs. We knew they would be well taken care of, and the 3 of us could dedicate ourselves to solving problems without obstacles or entertainment. With the permission of the family, we occupy the rooms so that we can sleep there and focus 24 hours a day on the case. It didn't take long for us to fill the house with cameras, sensors, and other gadgets that could alert us in case something strange happened. As usual, the parapsychologist took industrial amounts of caffeine in various forms to keep an eye on the devices and recommended that we go to sleep. Despite the silence and tranquility, perhaps by suggestion or instinct, we felt that something was wrong in that house. Strange presences were felt randomly, especially behind our backs, and we sometimes noticed strange movements of shadows out of the corner of our eyes. Just in case, we decided to shield the rooms where we slept with various protection elements and performed a ritual to keep any foreign elements away from these rooms. When we finished, we went to sleep, even though it was difficult for us to fall asleep. A few hours later, something woke me up. I had the feeling that someone was watching me. When I looked up, I saw a humanoid-looking shadow at the door that seemed to be staring at me. I felt like he wanted to hurt me. After a few seconds, it disappeared. This was definitely a case of shadow people. I got up and got dressed, went to see our partner with a surveillance camera complex and told him what I had seen. Excited, he showed me the recordings in which something cold was seen. Through the infrared cameras that moved erratically around the house, stopped at the door of my room and disappeared a few minutes later. I decided to stay with the parapsychologist until something beeped next to us. It was a warning that something strange was happening in a room. My partner made me take a camera and go to the room that had caused the beeps. That room, which was a living room, was surely finely decorated by the grandparents, since it was an intergenerational house that had been occupied by the same family for more than a century. When I shined the light on the sofa, I saw that something was looking at me, a dark figure sitting on that sofa with its head turned in my direction. The next second, he was up and slowly approaching me. The following seconds, which seemed eternal to me, that silhouette kept getting closer when I decided to sing an Our Father. That silhouette stopped and disappeared before my eyes. Everything had been recorded by the camera. I went back to the room that the parapsychologist used as a command center, and as he went there, he yelled loudly. My religious companion jumped up and ran to see what was the matter. I did the same. When we arrived, the parapsychologist was on the ground as if he had tried to run away from something and had a considerable scratch on his face. We tried to calm him down and help him up. He took off his shirt in front of us and told us that his back hurt. When he showed it to us, there were scratches just like the ones on his face. He told us that he was so calm checking the cameras when he felt that something was stalking him. When he turned, there were a couple of those beings that pounced on him without giving him time to react, causing him that damage. That was a red line that we could not tolerate. So, between the religious companion and I, we decided to start performing the necessary rituals to purify said house. We went room by room, spiritually cleaning the rooms, and decided to consecrate religious objects and put them in each room that we purified. Those rituals consumed 4 days of our lives, and finally, we managed to get rid of that evil aura that invaded the house. The day after finishing, we collected all the equipment, and the family was able to live normally again. The case of the 3 hooded dwarves. A family with nightmares, psychiatric medication that had no effect, exhaustion that prevented them from working and leading a normal life, sick leave that dragged on parents forever, and children who hadn't been to school for weeks. It all started with a request from the local priest who suspected that something strange was happening in that house. Due to the fact that the case did not arouse much interest and the exorcist's rejection of the diocese, I was commissioned to investigate it. Knowing that the matter was in the hands of a psychiatrist and that the family was taking medication for it, I believed that the matter would be resolved after speaking with them and convincing them to go to psychological therapy so that they would gradually return to normality in their lives. I went to the house after a drive of more than 5 hours and introduced myself to the family, who were relieved by my presence. They immediately let me in and invited me to spend the night there so that I could witness what was happening. Understanding that it was the best for them, I accepted, and they prepared a sofa bed in their home office. They told me that for months they had suffered nightly visits from 3 short hooded people who caused sleep paralysis, so they decided to see a doctor who referred them to a psychiatrist. They thought that it was all a matter of problems that could be solved through medication, but they soon found out that this was not true. You could see from their faces that they were exhausted and therefore did not take much care of their appearance. The children also showed signs of exhaustion that was not normal. That day, I proposed activities to cheer them up and managed to distract them a bit with board games and a huge potato omelette that I prepared for them to eat. I tried to do a little psychological work with them, which seemed to have an effect as they showed a little improvement. Night came and I asked the parents if I could tuck the children in and tell them a story. These children showed, for the first time all day, encouragement and happiness for this departure from their daily routine. When the children were asleep, I prepared a pot of fresh thyme that I brought and offered a cup to the parents, who drank it with delight and thanked me for my work. It had gotten late, and the parents offered me pajamas and escorted me to what would be my room that night. We said goodnight, and I thought that the next day the family would be much better. I was sleeping peacefully when I woke up suddenly with a tightness in my chest and a feeling of restlessness. When I tried to move, I realized that I couldn't. I instinctively panicked until I realized I was suffering from classic sleep paralysis. When I looked to my right side in the direction of the office table, I saw them. 3 short hooded people were next to me. Knowing that it could be a nightmare and being fully aware, I asked them to leave me alone. Those beings were still there, and one of them took his hand out of the tunic and touched my arm. Seeing that they were not listening to reason, I began to pray hard, which had an effect, and the 3 mysterious beings disappeared. So I went back to sleep. The next day, I was woken up by my parents, who again showed that tired face and signs of exhaustion. They asked me how I spent the night, and I told them my experience. I told them that those visitors did not give off any evil, and that it was most likely that they were just, so they would understand, passing spirits curious about them. Seeing that the case was simple, I prepared breakfast for the family and gave them clear instructions on how to act in this situation. My recipe was very easy. When they found themselves in that situation, they first had to overcome the panic through positive thoughts. If it was difficult for them, being believers, they just had to concentrate on a prayer like the Our Father. Then, they had to try to move a toe, focusing on that toe until they managed to move it. The day passed quickly as we filled the time once again with board games, funny stories, and various activities. Night came and we went to sleep. The next day I was woken up very early by the children, who were happy that they had managed to get the visitors to leave after following my instructions. I was happy with them and congratulated them. I made them a copious breakfast. That night they had slept well, and it was noticeable by the energy they had. After a couple of hours, the parents woke up and thanked me for those instructions and for having prepared breakfast for them. Seeing the improvement in the situation, I left saying goodbye to the family. The following weeks I was contacting them to make sure everything was fine. From what they told me, as the days went by, they received fewer and fewer visits from those beings, until one day they stopped appearing. The case of the dead twin, a family torn apart by the death of a son due to illness, the twin of said son in treatment for alleged post-traumatic stress, attitudes that worsened over time, and strange things that happened in the family home. In this specific case, from the beginning, something smelled bad to me. As usual, I was moved to the family home and offered the local parish house for accommodation. The family had come to the church as they saw no improvement in their son, despite medical treatment. He was delirious more and more and spent his days talking to his dead brother. Many nights, the family witnessed unexplained paranormal events, and they were desperate for their son. My job was to discern if this was a strange case that I could solve or a simple grieving process that had gone wrong. The parents told me that a few months ago they had lost one of their sons to leukemia, and that since then their other son had become obsessed with spiritualism and was looking for ways to reconnect with his brother. Knowing that the bond they had was very special, they did not pay attention to what he was doing and thought that it would be the best way to overcome the pain caused by the mourning of the loss. As the weeks passed, his son began to show strange attitudes, talking to his dead brother and performing strange rituals in his room at night. When one night they found him sleepwalking with a knife in his hand, they decided to take him to the doctor to try to put an end to what was happening. According to the doctors, everything was the result of the loss, and they prescribed psychotropic medication, especially antipsychotics, so that he would gradually return to normality. That medication not only did not have the desired effect, but also his son was in a state of constant drunkenness and continued in his delusions with his deceased brother. It was not only that, since for a few weeks they had heard strange noises at night in different parts of the house, and it was common for them to see strange things in the mirrors. As they could not find a solution to that, they decided to tell the local priest, who is the one who mobilized me to study the case. The first thing I did was interview the teenager. He was in a strange trance, probably because of all the medication he was taking, and was constantly interrupted by his brother, as he said, because my questions annoyed him. That alleged refusal of his dead brothers to my questions made me suspect that this was not a case of mourning, so I asked the parents' permission to find out what kind of rituals their son had been performing. I went through his room and found dozens of internet-sourced printed pages of strange rituals for summoning the dead. I checked the young man's computer and found that he had been visiting pages and forums dedicated to contact with spirits and beings from beyond the grave. When I had all the information, I spoke with the parents and told them what their son had been doing. Then I asked them to tell me all the possible information about their deceased son, since I feared the worst, and asked their permission to hypnotize their son. At first they were reluctant, but when they understood that it was the best way to deal with the problem, they gave their approval. Due to the young man's altered state of consciousness due to the medication, it was very easy to proceed, so I focused on using it to talk to his alleged brother. At first, he spoke on his behalf and answered the questions he asked without any problem, which left his parents amazed. But everything changed when I decided to make him ask about made-up things, to which he answered with lies, which I blamed him for. At that moment, the attitude of the alleged channeled youth changed and he proceeded to resist. The poor hypnotized teenager was in physical pain, so I decided to cut the session short. The parents showed me their anger, so I had to explain to them that most likely, due to the rituals he had performed and his lack of preparation, he had summoned something that was posing as his brother while trying to possess him. I told them that all those strange phenomena that occurred, especially at night, were nothing more than potential physical alterations caused by that entity, which was gaining more and more strength by feeding on its son. When the adolescent calmed down and with the supervision of the parents, I proceeded to a new hypnosis session until I was able to break the blockade that entity exerted on the young man. Somehow the victim, who was in a trance, asked me for help since he had realized that this was not his brother. He described an entity that looked like a face with scary tattoos, and through him, I was able to learn the name of said entity. Knowing that this was not a case of mishandled mourning, I decided it was time to perform an exorcism on both the young man and the house. I explained to the parents how I was going to proceed and that I was going to ask for help from the exorcist in their area. I retired to the parsonage to rest, and the next day, the assigned exorcist arrived. We had a short interview in which I updated him on the case. I even played the recordings made of the hypnosis sessions, and we got down to it. Those rituals took us 3 days and 3 nights, until finally the strange noises and knocks in the house ceased, and the victim returned, as much as possible, to normality. The family listened to me and decided to go to a psychological therapist, and the young man returned little by little to his normal life. Here ends the summary of some of the cases of this stage. A few last words. During this manuscript, I have tried to convey my experience, as you have seen, quite varied, of cases that I still face today. I have tried that the cases were not repetitive and, above all, I have masked any detail that makes it possible to locate them or give clues about the people affected. Good does not exist without evil, and evil does not exist without good. Both are sides of the same coin, and we humans live exposed to both sides throughout our lives. In the pages you have read, I am sure you have been able to understand that there are things that transcend the normality to which we are accustomed. The lack of education in these matters makes us doubt them and even turn to so-called experts who do not solve the problems that afflict us throughout our lives and that have no explanation according to the standards of our society. Existence is much more complex than we know. Little by little, thanks to science, we are learning about particles that are in several places at the same time. We discover that there are realities that we do not perceive with our senses and that surround us. We see further and further in time and space, and we also understand that the laws of physics apply in different ways in the macrocosm and the microcosm. I can only tell you that in the face of things that scare us and are unknown to us, we should not be afraid. The curiosity that is innate in us has made us explore the world and continue to break the barriers that separate us from wonders that we have not yet seen. I am sure that over the years, perhaps over the centuries, we will learn to coexist and explain those things that at the moment sound strange and science ignores. I thank you for the time dedicated to reading this work, and I hope that it will serve to open a little that curious mind that has led you to read this page. I wish you, from my heart, that you have a prosperous and long life full of happiness.